Autism Canada depends on the generous support of viewers like you. If you find this presentation helpful, consider donating at autismcanada.org.
I've had the pleasure to hear Dr. Adams speak numerous occasions in the United States, and when he said he'd come here today, I was very, very excited. He's a professor at Arizona State University, and his research focus is on the causes of autism and how to treat it. He's also a dad. He has 3 children, one of which is diagnosed on the spectrum. He has produced a number of reports, and he has produced many peer-reviewed journal articles, but one that is available on Autism Canada's website is the updated summary of dietary, nutritional, and medical treatments for autism. Over 150 peer-reviewed articles were reviewed to compile this paper. Those of you that are in the audience would have been sent an email asking you to read the paper before this lecture, and it was also on our conference brochure and on our Facebook page to do so. With that, I'd like to invite Dr. Adams to the podium, and I'm sure we'll all love his message.
Thanks very much, Lori, and Lori for organizing a conference. It takes a huge amount of work, and really appreciate that. Give me just a moment to get to the slides. Okay, so before I get to the main part of my presentation, which you should have a copy of, I've added 4 new slides because although I'm mostly going to talk about treatment, I realize no one else at the conference seemed to be talking about prevention. So I want to just briefly say a few words about that, because in the last few months there have been 2 major studies telling us how we can prevent many of the cases of autism out there. And this is very important news. We need to really push to get this information out there. So one of the studies done by Charge involved 429 autism families, 270 atypical families, and they found that lower folic acid intake, so a very important B vitamin, folic acid, there was a lower intake of mothers of kids with autism, mothers who eventually had a child with autism versus typical moms. It's not a huge difference. It's about a 20% difference, but this actually was found to be an enormous risk factor, and that intake above 600 micrograms a day was associated with a 38% decreased risk of having a child with autism. And if you had an even higher intake, there was an even higher decrease in the risk. So this tells us that folic acid is very important. Part of the reason is due to a genetic difference in a particular enzyme in mothers of children with autism. Now this is consistent with many other studies that we know showing children with autism have problems with folic acid, but also there was a very similar study also released just a few months ago, which found effectively the same thing. This is a study done in Norway, where they looked at 85,000 Norwegian children, including 270 children with autism. In Norway, they had just begun implementing mandatory folic acid supplements, and they found that in the mothers who took folic acid, right around the time of conception, so during the period 4 weeks prior to conception to 8 weeks after conception, they found that they had less than half the incidence of autism if they took the folic acid. And so again, it related to a 39% lower risk of autism in those who took prenatal folic acid. So again, the problem is that many women wait to take a prenatal supplement until they know that they're pregnant, and this may be 2 or 3 months into the pregnancy. And both of these studies show that it doesn't help then. It has to be taken around the period of conception. That's the crucial time. We know folic acid is important for preventing other birth defects like spina bifida, but now we have very clear evidence that is also extremely important for autism. And this is consistent with many other studies, so I just want to share one other very closely related study to you. That it's very important that we also look at what are unusual health risks that the mothers of children with autism are exposed to. that there's a very simple standardized test you can get during your annual physical. It's a cheap, inexpensive standard test, a measure of homocysteine. There have been 2 published studies by a top research group showing that homocysteine levels are 26 to 34% higher in mothers of children with autism. They also found increased levels in dads, but in that study they did not have a control group of dads, but looking at reference ranges, it seems that dads also had increased levels. Elevated homocysteine is a risk factor, an important risk factor for coronary artery disease. So if you have elevated homocysteine, you have an increased risk of blood clots, of heart attacks, and strokes. I just, a week ago, met a 31-year-old mother of a child with autism who had just had her first heart attack. So it's also been shown to be a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease and several birth defects. This is very important, and it's totally correctable. It's totally correctable simply by having your levels checked, and if your level is high, then just taking folic acid or taking vitamin B12. Now we know that kids with autism don't do so well on the standard form of folic acid, which is an oxidized, less active form, so they may need a reduced form called folinic acid. But again, I think every mother of a child with autism should have their homocysteine levels checked, because we need to keep our moms healthy to take care of the dads and the kids, okay? All right. So now I want to get to the main part of my talk, which is an overview of biomedical treatments for autism. And this is going to get technical in parts. I'm going to cover 17 different treatments, but again, if you can just follow the main points, and which is when to consider a treatment, when not to. So I'm a president's professor at Arizona State University. I'm also the president of the Autism Society of Greater Phoenix. I'm an engineer by background, but 10 years ago, over 10 years ago, I was very frustrated at the lack of research on treatments for autism, and so that was why I switched most of my research to focus on treatments for autism. And that's because of my daughter's diagnosis. Also, if you want more information, there's a website, and you can get a copy of many of our other articles there too. So our research group is dedicated to finding the causes of autism, how to prevent autism, and how to best help people with autism. We focus on biomedical interventions. That's our area of expertise, but very supportive of behavioral and other interventions as well. So the main areas we've worked on, and we're very broad, unusually broad in our research. We've looked at nutritional issues, vitamins, minerals, fatty acids, and amino acids. We've looked at metabolism, looking at glutathione, methylation, sulfation, oxidative stress. I'll explain those as we go along. We looked at mitochondria, which are the energy-producing factories in your body. We've looked at toxic metals and how to remove toxic metals. We've looked at gut problems. We've looked at sleep problems. We've looked at immune function. We've looked at seizures. We've looked at a lot of different things. And later today, I'll give a talk on seizures as well. So the summary that we've written is based on 150 published research studies in peer-reviewed journals. Each chapter, each treatment has been reviewed by a medical expert, so I wrote it, but then had an expert review it. It's an official publication of the Autism Research Institute, which is the oldest autism research foundation in the world, founded by Bernie Rimland, the man who stood up many years ago and said that autism is not due to mothers hating their children, which was the prevailing theory. It is a medical disorder. So it's a 50-page summary. It's meant to be read by parents, but also something they can take to their physician and say, this is the test I'm considering, here's the reason I'm considering it, here's the treatment I'd like to do based on the results of these tests. So just follows the Defeat Autism Now philosophy, which is listen to people with autism, listen to their parents, physicians, and researchers. Many of the treatments I'm going to discuss were originally discovered because parents found something helped their child, they talked about it with their physicians, and then eventually the researchers got into the act and investigated it. But a real focus is not on treating a symptom, not on trying to reduce a child's aggression by sedating them, but our focus instead is to look for what is the underlying cause of those symptoms, because autism is just a label for a collection of symptoms, but the word autism doesn't tell us anything about the underlying medical causes, and so that's what I'm going to focus on today. And again, as I mentioned earlier, biomedical interventions are important, but by no means the only intervention. And simply if a child has major diarrhea, if they're having seizures, that's going to interfere with their learning. So let's treat those medical problems. They can become better learners and respond better to behavioral, educational, and other therapies. And Bernie Rimland said a number of years ago, when people thought it was far too radical, when my daughter was diagnosed and we were told autism is untreatable, the bottom line is that is not true. There are a number of children out there who have improved greatly or even lost their autism diagnosis, and sometimes looking at the medical side can be an important part for that. So if you want more information on this, there's a couple references for you. The first book is more like an encyclopedia. It's very detailed. And the second is written by a medical doctor, again, saying many of the same things. So this is the outline of the presentation, all of the different treatments that I want to talk about. And this is more or less the order in which I would recommend considering the treatments. So first of all, just give me a sense of hands. For the parents out there, how many of you have implemented some of the treatments on this list? Okay. And how many have implemented most of the treatments on this list? All right, a few out there. All right, good. So we're going to go through these more or less in order. And again, this is just a general suggestion of order in which to do them. But then also, there are particular reasons why you might want to skip and do a different order. Right now, we just finished a study in which we looked at a combination of 6 of these treatments, and we found some very great benefits in the children, including a 9-point increase in IQ, which is pretty impressive. So that's unpublished data, so I can't share all of it, but I'll mention a few things as we go along. Okay, so first and most basic thing, and often the most forgotten, is improving the diet. Most children in the US, perhaps in Canada too, don't eat enough vegetables and whole fruit. That if they aren't getting the basic nutrients their body needs, but are instead eating potato chips, popcorn, chicken nuggets, it's not a very healthy diet. So making sure they consume enough protein, greatly avoiding or reducing added sugar. So the average person in the US eats over 100 pounds of sugar a year. It's ridiculous. There's one little boy I know who was in a day program, and he was very violent. He had several aggressive episodes each day. One day he broke his therapist's nose punching him. This little guy, 6 years old. And so when they took away his 2 sodas a day, his several candy bars, his behavioral problems mostly disappeared. He went down to 1 to 2 aggressive episodes a month. And the reason is very simple. When you take pure sugar, you'll have a rapid rise and then fall in your blood sugar levels, and it will cause great irritation. Even a glass of orange juice can do that, will greatly raise and then lower your blood sugar. But if you eat a whole orange, because of the fiber, then the blood sugar rises more slowly and falls more slowly. So again, just by removing sugar can be a very important issue. Avoiding junk food, greatly reducing or avoiding fried foods containing trans fats, avoiding artificial colors, flavors, and preservatives. There was a major study that came out that showed that children who consumed artificial colors in their drinks at school versus those who did not get those artificial colors in their drinks, even in the typical kids, it caused significant learning problems. A very major study. And if possible, eating organic foods because they don't contain pesticides. Who wants to have extra added chemicals to your body? Who wants to have a dose of lead or mercury or arsenic added to their child's food? So just washing the fruit if you can afford organic foods, and is just a perfectly fine option as well. I'm going to talk a bit about ARI survey data. Now this is just survey data, so it's not the most rigorous type of research, but for some treatments it's the only data that we have. It's compiled from a collection of 25,000 individuals, 25,000 families who have completed survey data. So it's a little bit better than asking your friend Joe what worked for their child. We're asking 25,000 families what worked for their child. So removing sugar, very rarely does that make your child worse. Okay, 2% of the time. How often do they get better? Half the time they get better, half the time they don't, based on a report of 3,700 families. Feingold diet, which involves removing artificial colors, flavors, preservatives, again, seem to help about half of children with autism. One thing you're going to find as I talk is that there's no one treatment that's going to help every child with autism. because there are probably multiple reasons, multiple factors that contribute to a child's autism, but the treatments I'm going to talk about are the ones that seem to help a particular subset. If we have a treatment that even helped 10% of kids with autism, I'd be very happy with that. So benefits of improving the diet: vegetables and fruits contain essential vitamins and minerals that we know are critical to mental and physical health. They also contain what are called phytonutrients, which you won't get out of a standard vitamin supplement, but there are thousands of additional phytonutrients present in whole foods and whole fruits and vegetables. Protein is a very large molecule, and your digestive system chops it up and digests it into individual amino acids, and then reassembles those amino acids into many parts of your body, into your muscle, into your hormones, into your neurotransmitters. So protein, and getting enough protein, is very important, and some children don't get enough. Reducing sugar intake, I talked about. Pesticides often causing toxic metals, and many pesticides, by the way, are designed to target the nervous system in insects to induce seizures in the insects. So many seizures that they become paralyzed and die, and they attack many of them target a particular neurotransmitter, which is the same neurotransmitter present in humans. So why expose yourself to a chemical that is designed to induce seizures in insects? So just avoiding that. And again, this very large study I mentioned by McCannon, that even giving typical children artificial colors or certain food preservatives is very damaging to their functioning. Okay, so food sensitivities. So I'm going to move pretty quick because we have a lot of different topics to cover. But food sensitivities. If your child has red cheeks, if they have dark circles under their eyes, if they have red ears, this may indicate that they have food allergies or food sensitivities. And so you can also look for behavioral changes after they eat a particular food. So say with a peanut allergy, it may be very clear, a child goes into anaphylactic shock immediately. But that's one category of food allergies or food sensitivities. That's an immediate reaction, but you can also have delayed reactions that may occur over the time span of 2 or 3 days. One of the best ways to test is to just do a diet log and just watch for a pattern between, oh, my child had a very bad behavioral meltdown this day, and let's look at what foods they had eaten previously. There are blood tests available, IgE and IgG. Blood testing is available by many commercial labs. IgE tells you about an immediate allergic response, whereas IgG tells you about a delayed response. These tests can be a guide as to what might be a possible food sensitivity, but they are limited. And so you want to use them as a potential guide, but they're not definitive. The definitive test, according to the National Immune Sensitivity, National Allergen, I'm forgetting the name of it now, the National Allergy Association, is to just do an elimination diet. Remove all of the most likely potential food allergens. So the most common ones are gluten, which is present in wheat, rye, barley, and some oats. Dairy products, so milk, anything milk-related, sour cream, ice cream. Sugar, corn, soy, yeast, peanuts, eggs, artificial colors and preservatives. Removing all of those and then slowly adding them back in. You might think, gee, removing all of those, what is there left to eat? Well, there's rice, there's vegetables, all sorts of protein sources, a lot of good, healthy foods out there to still consider. So just adding them in back one at a time, every 4 days, then gives you a sense of what is a potential problem. That's really viewed as the gold standard. So you see if removing it causes a problem, it results in benefits, and then when you add it back in, does it cause a problem? That's the gold standard test for sensitivity to food. So benefits, you can see wide improvements in behavior, in learning and attention. There was a major study in the US of 40,000 children showing that 8% of them have food allergies, especially to peanuts, milk, and shellfish are the most common. So again, food allergies are common, but seem to be especially common in children with autism. So this is, again, some ARI survey data showing that just checking for foods you're allergic to and removing them, 60% of the children improve. Doing a rotation diet, so not eating the same food every day. The food you're most likely to be allergic to, to is the food you eat every single day. So if every morning you have a glass of orange juice, there's probably a good chance your body's become allergic to orange juice. Because think about historically how humans developed as hunters and gatherers. They ate the food that was available that season, all right? So we varied our food sources. Removing chocolate, I hate to say it, but chocolate is not an essential food group. And so removing it seems to help about half of kids, perhaps because of the sugar or dairy. And also eggs, unfortunately, because eggs are a wonderful protein source, but it does seem that about 40% of the kids improve from removing eggs. There have been a number of research studies I'll just touch on briefly. A study by Vajani found that many children with autism have food allergies. 3 studies by Giannucci at Columbia University found children with autism have more hypersensitivities to food allergens than the typical children, and she found that it seemed to be associated with GI problems. There's a study by Lucarelli finding that putting child on an 8-week diet that avoided allergic foods seemed to help children with autism. There's a study by Kushik and Bowie from Harvard Medical School. This is a very large study of 199 children and adults with autism. And they found that many of them, children, had low levels of digestive enzymes, particularly enzymes for digesting complex sugars, especially the sugar in dairy and milk products called lactose, that many kids with autism are lactose intolerant. Okay? Many other studies by Horvath and others finding that gut inflammation is common in children with autism. So there's often inflammation in the esophagus, throughout the intestines, but you won't see it unless you do an endoscopy. And sadly, in my experience, many children with autism who need to see a gastroenterologist are not provided with that medical service. Oh, that's just autism. Excuse me, what does a behavioral label of poor language have to do with GI function? Why can't they have GI problems? So in fact, many kids with autism do have GI problems and should be seen by a gastroenterologist. And we think a lot of that will then relate to food allergies. Bottom line is that if your gut is inflamed, you're much more likely to have then an allergic response. But if you can reduce that inflammation in the GI tract, then many of the food allergies will disappear. So one of the most common type of food allergies are gluten and casein. And so this is a very standard diet. There's been a lot of research on it, and I'll go through that. But basically it involves totally avoiding gluten, casein, and often avoiding corn and soy as well. And the rationale is very simple. Human digestive system has evolved over 1 million years. Only in the last 10,000 years or so have we been eating high amounts of gluten, and only in certain parts of the world have we been consuming high amounts of dairy products, and over a shorter time period. So humans are the only mammal who consume milk as adults. You might think it was very odd of other animals. We're the only mammal on the planet that consumes milk as adults. We're the only mammal on the planet that consumes milk from another species. Okay, don't you think it would be strange if a cat went up to a dog that had just given birth and began suckling from it? Well, folks, many of us go and suckle from cows as adults. It's very bizarre behavior. And because you're consuming milk from another species, it's very likely that you will develop an allergic response to that. Not everyone, but many people. Also, over the last several hundred years, wheat has been changed purposely to greatly increase the amount of gluten present in the wheat. So by increasing the amount of gluten, it makes it more sticky, it makes your pizza dough more sticky, your bread hold together better, but it means there's a much higher gluten content than there was previously. So some people then develop celiac disease, which is a very severe GI disorder. Most kids with autism don't have official celiac disease, but they have a very similar response to dairy, to wheat, but sometimes less severe. So these are common food allergens, especially in children and adults with autism. There are multiple reasons why we're suspicious of them. One theory is that certain peptides from gluten and casein can bind to an opioid-like receptor in the brain. Now, why in the world would we have an opioid receptor in the brain that responds to dairy? Well, what is absolutely critical for an infant when it has just been born? It must want and desire mother's milk. So after an infant consumes mother's milk, then the milk, some of the proteins travel through the bloodstream and travel to the opioid receptor in the brain and cause a drug-induced high, just like morphine or heroin. And then the child goes into a drug-induced sleep after nursing and then wakes up wanting more of what it is addicted to. And so because of that, then this is a wonderful survival mechanism for infants. However, as the child's digestive system matures, then at about 12 months, the digestive system has matured, so now it can completely digest those proteins. They no longer have that opioid-like effect, so consuming mother's milk no longer triggers that opioid receptor in the brain, and hence, around the age of 12 months, when their digestive system has matured, the infant naturally loses interest in mother's milk and now begins to move on to other foods. So that's an interesting theory as to what might be part of the problem with milk products for autism because of an impaired digestive system. Again, we need more research on that theory, but it's a very intriguing theory. But also it appears that there's clear evidence of inflammation in the GI tract. And also, as I mentioned, lactose and milk intolerance is very common in children with autism due to lack of digestive enzymes. So implementing the gluten-free, casein-free diet is very simple. It just involves total 100% avoidance of gluten and casein. The problem is that gluten and casein are present in so many foods. If you went and bought a box of raisins, it wouldn't say that there's any gluten on the box of raisins, but they've probably been dusted with wheat flour to prevent them from sticking together. If you go out and buy a box of frozen potatoes, they've probably been dusted with wheat to prevent them from sticking together. It doesn't say anywhere on the label, but it's probably there. And so it can be very difficult to avoid them. But I've seen many children who just a bite of a cookie will be enough to cause a behavioral problem for a day or two. Some children not so sensitive, but some are. Digestive enzymes can be helpful, especially if there's an accidental exposure. But it's kind of like letting your child get bit by a snake and then giving them the antidote. Let's just avoid them taking the poison in to begin with. And many children also seem to benefit by removing corn. Corn, again, has changed dramatically in the last 500 years. It is a grass that used to be, the ear of corn was minuscule, and now it's these enormous ears of corn. They've been greatly, greatly changed. So the benefits that seem to be greatest among the children who most crave dairy or wheat, the child who wants to drink a quart of milk a day, and so if they're consuming a large amount of it, those often seem to be the kids who benefit the most. Going on a casein-free diet seems to produce benefits within a month. Often I've seen families who will try it within a week. They'll tell me their child is just much better, much more with it, much more aware. They seem to no longer be in a drug-induced daze. But gluten usually takes a little bit longer, up to 3 months, to see similar benefits. In terms of statistics, if you go on a casein-free diet, about half of children seem to respond. A gluten-free diet, about half seem to respond. If you do both, about 2/3 seem to respond. Not everyone responds from it, but many do. In the 12-month treatment study we just finished, we found that this is one of the top 3 treatments for children with autism. But it is important, and there is some published literature showing that if children go on a dairy-free diet, and if they are not consuming a good amount of vegetables, which are actually an excellent source of calcium, then they may become calcium deficient. So this is one of the few safety notes I'm going to mention. Most of the treatments I'm recommending are very safe, but this is one I just want to make sure it's important to know that taking a calcium supplement is an important thing to consider, important thing to do if you're on a dairy-free diet. Research on the diet, Carl Reichout from Norway has conducted several studies which have found abnormal peptides in urine of people with autism, and Paul Shattuck in the UK has found the same thing. A couple groups did not find those, and now we've discovered the reason is they did not use proper preservation techniques. These peptides disappear from the urine within a few hours. They need to be tested immediately. There was a single blind study of 10 children with autism, found that 8 of 10 benefited from a gluten-free diet. There was then a 12-week double-blind crossover study. So double-blind means it's a more rigorous type of study in which half of the children receive the treatment, half don't receive the treatment, but neither the families nor the physicians doing the evaluations know who is in which group. So you do the treatment, you do the evaluation, and then at the end of that time period, at the end of that 13 weeks, then you break the code to see who was doing the treatment and who wasn't, and you compare the results. And this was a crossover study, so those who were not on the diet were then started on the diet. Those who were on the diet then went to the placebo. So it's a very rigorous type of study. It was only done for 12 weeks, only done with 15 children, and the results were not statistically significant, but the researchers did make the comment that the parents reported improvements which were not captured on the limited questionnaires that they were using. Unfortunately, kids with autism don't have a little dial on them telling us how autistic they are at that moment. And so the tools that we use as researchers to evaluate autism are not that great. They're getting better, but still not that great. But then there was a much longer study and a much larger study, a 12-month study, a single-blind study of 55 children with autism, and they found that there were significantly great improvements in those on the diet, including improvements in communication using the ADOS, which is the gold standard for diagnosing autism, and to see a change on that is pretty astonishing. I don't know of any other study where there's been an improvement on the ADOS score except this study. And also some improvements based on parent observations of improvements in social interaction, interactivity, inattention, hyperactivity, and daily living skills. Now, these were not huge improvements. I don't want to say these children recurred, but noticeable improvements, some improving more than others. There was also a study by Cade who found that long-term use of digestive enzymes was beneficial, but the gluten-free diet was even more helpful. He also did a large study of 150 children with autism, found 87% had antibodies to gluten versus 1% of typical children. And then he found 90% of them had antibodies to casein versus 7% of the typical kids. So even typical kids can have problems with dairy products because, again, mother's milk is a wonderful thing. Cow's milk after the age of nursing, not necessarily so great. Cade then went on to study 70 children with autism who followed a gluten-free, casein-free diet for at least 1 year. He found 81% of them improved by the end of the 3rd month, and the improvements continued over the next 12 months. He found improvements in social interaction, in eye contact, mutism, learning skills, hyperactivity, stereotypy, and panic attacks. Of the 19% who did not improve, they then did a test of their blood and found a third of them, although they thought they were following a gluten-free diet, were not. They still had significant amounts of gluten and casein in their blood, and so that's telling us that that percentage may even have been a higher rate. But it is difficult to implement. You need to make sure you're avoiding all of the potential foods. There are some tests out there to test for allergies to dairy and wheat, but those tests are not very reliable, and again, there might be multiple reasons besides just an allergic response why these foods are problematic. So the best test is just to do the diet. You can do the testing if you want, but regardless of the test results, just do the diet and find out. There are a number of other diets out there, and they're intriguing. One intriguing one is the specific carbohydrate diet, especially if you're having major GI problems, but there's not been very much research on those other diets yet. I hope there would be more. But if you want more information, you can go here for to the Autism Network for Dietary Intervention to learn about these other approaches. So another favorite area of mine is vitamin mineral supplements. Many people forget that the definition of a vitamin or a mineral is a substance that has been proven to be essential for the human body. The body cannot make it, and it must be in the diet, and without it, you will develop serious disease or die from a lack of it. So vitamins and minerals are absolutely essential to human life. Most people in the US consume less than the RDA of one or more vitamins or minerals. For example, many women lack enough calcium, leading to osteoporosis when they become older. Many women have low iron due to blood loss from the menstrual flow. And hence, again, develop anemia, and it's a serious problem for their children as well. So treatment is very simple. Eat your fruits and vegetables, okay? And so unfortunately, and meat and other sources too, but unfortunately most people don't eat their 6 servings of fruits and vegetables a day. How many of you do you think ate 6 servings of fruits and vegetables yesterday? Okay, decent number, good, good, all right? So, but many people are not getting enough. So ARI survey data shows that many children did not, many children seem to benefit from taking individual vitamins or minerals, so we think that's very intriguing. We led a small double-blind placebo-controlled study of a multivitamin mineral supplement, and we found that it led to improvements in children with autism, particularly in terms of sleep and gut function, which often go together. That was a small study, but a valid one. We then went on to, then there was another group who looked at very high-dose vitamin C, which is important for many functions in the body, including production of certain key neurotransmitters, led to some behavioral additions. Then there have been several other studies that show that children have substantial oxidative stress, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But because of high levels of oxidative stress, one of the best ways to combat that is through antioxidants, which come from vitamins and minerals. So we went on to do a 12-month randomized double-blind placebo-controlled, 12-week randomized double-blind placebo-controlled study of a vitamin mineral supplement that we designed. We published the work on that. We found many abnormalities in levels of vitamins and minerals, and also in many other key parts of metabolism. So glutathione is the body's primary antioxidant, and it was lower in children with autism. It's also the primary defense against toxic metals. Methylation is also a very important process. It's folic acid helps with the production of the precursors to make glutathione and to make methylation. Methylation helps turn certain key proteins on and off, such as your DNA and RNA. Oxidative stress, basically when your body consumes fuel. When your mitochondria are working to produce fuel, it creates oxidative stress, free radicals, which can damage the body if we don't have enough antioxidants. Sulfation and neurotransmitters, I'll talk a little bit more about these later. So we found many biochemical abnormalities in children with autism, and we found that the vitamin mineral supplement was surprisingly effective at improving or even normalizing many of the biomarkers that we looked at. I don't have time to go into all of those, that would be a whole talk, but I'll just summarize the behavioral results for you. So behaviorally, we looked at, on a scale of -3 to +3, plus being better, we found that giving just a placebo was a great stuff. Giving just sugar water in a placebo is the blue bar, and we found improvements in expressive language, improvements in receptive language, improvements in play, cognition, etc. And that's what we call the placebo effect. Present in virtually any research study you do, just the sheer hope of giving something to your child, you think that there will be some improvement. And that's why an open label study is limited. That's why we do a placebo-controlled study, because the red bar shows the group that received the real supplement, and they did better in every category here. And the stars indicate the categories where there was so much better that the difference is actually statistically significant. So this is a large study of 141 children and adults with autism, and in general, we saw good improvements across the board in many areas. But the way to best interpret this, I would say, is that 1/3 of the kids really did very, very well. 1/3 of them had some benefit, and 1/3 of them really didn't benefit much at all. But again, I think it's a very important area. And then also, one of the best ways, I think, to get vitamins and minerals is just through fruits and vegetables. And one great way to get fruits and vegetables into your child is through vegetable juicing. So fresh vegetable and fruit juice is a great source of vitamins, minerals, and other nutrients. However, commercialized fruit juices are not that great. That orange juice, after it is processed, after it is pasteurized, has 0 vitamin C left in it after it's manufactured. They then add back in vitamin C at the processing plant to restore what had been destroyed by the heating, because vitamins are very sensitive to heat. Then, if it sits on the delivery truck and sits in the supermarket and sits in your refrigerator, by the time you drink it, the amount of vitamin C left in your orange juice is pretty modest. It's about 20% of what might have been there the day it was manufactured. Whereas if you took an orange and squeezed it, you'd be getting of order 5 times as much vitamin C from that fresh orange. So that's why I think it's so important to do vegetable and fruit juicing, and then you can store it in a glass container, which will be impervious to getting water or oxygen through it to damage the vitamins, and then it can be stable for a good week or so. So again, there's a few more hints there, but I need to keep moving to go on. But again, just a great way to get your fruits and vegetables, especially you want to focus on a lot of vegetables and enough fruit to flavor it. Okay, moving on to high-dose vitamin B6 and magnesium. There have been over 20 research studies on the treatment efficacy of high-dose vitamin B6 with magnesium, including 12 double-blind, placebo-controlled studies, making it one of the most well-studied treatments for autism. And if Dave doesn't mind me saying a little story, many years ago, Bernie Rimland, who was a very strong advocate of vitamin B6, tried to get many companies to help him produce a vitamin B6 for children with autism. And so he finally found one company out of many that would actually produce a flavored high-dose vitamin B6 supplement for children with autism, and that company, Kirkman Labs, then went on to make many other supplements as well. So it's been very helpful. But again, there have been many studies showing the treatment efficacy of vitamin B6 with magnesium, including 12 double-blind, placebo-controlled studies, making it one of the best studied treatments for autism. Almost all the studies found of order 30 to 50% of children and adults benefit. The reason is that vitamin B6 is needed for over 100 enzymatic reactions in the body, including production of almost all of your major neurotransmitters, dopamine, serotonin, and many others. And also it helps make glutathione, which is the antioxidant that many children with autism are low in, so you need more of it. And magnesium has helped to prevent possible hyperactivity. If you take B6 by itself, you may 20% of the time see some hyperactivity. You want to take the B6 with magnesium. Vitamins and minerals work together in many cases. You need both of them. I could go on into the reasons, but I'll skip over that due to time. The recommended dosage is typically about 8 milligrams per pound of body weight. Yeah, a 100-pound individual might need about 800 milligrams, so even up to a gram. Bernie would like to tell a story of one boy at living in a residential home, and by mistake, his caregivers didn't really understand dosing, so instead of giving him the regular dose each day, they gave him the regular dose at breakfast and again at lunch and again at dinner, so he got 3 times the normal amount, and he was doing great. So it seems to be extremely safe. Nothing is perfectly safe, but of order less than probably 1 in 5,000 times is there a potential problem with very high dose B6 and magnesium. In very rare cases, you can see temporary loss of feeling in fingertips, and then as soon as you stop it, then it disappears. That is exceptionally rare. Over 40 years, there have been of order half a dozen cases or so reported to ARI about that. So in general, exceptional safety record, even though it is a very high dose, about 1,000 times the RDA. Moving on, essential fatty acids. Essential fatty acids are critical nutrients just like vitamins, just like minerals, just like protein. You also need certain essential fats. You must have them. They exist in every membrane of your cell. So every cell membrane in your body has these certain essential fats, omega-3s and omega-6s, and they affect the permeability and flexibility of that membrane. So very important to membrane function. When an infant is born, 20% of the weight of that infant's brain is composed of these essential fats. Mother's milk is very rich in these essential fats because it's so critical for brain development. There have been studies showing that if an infant is born premature and does not receive these essential fats, they'll lose of order 5 IQ points. So very important to brain development. There are 2 general categories of essential fats called omega-3 and omega-6. Unfortunately, omega-3s have very short shelf life. So commercial food processors go to great lengths to remove omega-3s from our diet by hydrogenating, partially hydrogenating, bleaching, or deodorizing them, and so really destroying their nutritional value. And thus it's estimated that over 80% of the US population is not consuming enough omega-3s. Pretty much the only major source left in our diet is seafood, fish. And so low levels of essential fatty acids are associated with a wide range of psychiatric disorders, including depression, postpartum depression, bipolar disorder, Rett syndrome, which is similar to autism. Most importantly, there have been 4 published studies now showing that children with autism have abnormal levels of these omega-3s and omega-6 fatty acids. And so even though the general population is low, kids with autism are even worse than the general population. And so then there have been several studies showing that giving essential fatty acids is very beneficial. There's a small open label study done down in southern Arizona, found that just giving fish oil seemed to improve, led to a number of general improvements. There was a small double-blind placebo-controlled study suggesting that it may help reduce hyperactivity in children with autism. We did a small study in which we found that there were some improvements, especially in the kids who were not consuming seafood once a week. So if you were consuming seafood less than once a week, then you're probably low in omega-3 fatty acids, and those are the kids who seem to benefit more. So a question I would ask you to think about for the parents out there is you can spend several $100s on the blood test to see if your child's low in essential fatty acids, or you can just ask, is my child eating fish at least once a week? Hopefully your fish is not eating your child. Okay, so if your child's eating fish at least once a week, they're probably getting enough omega-3 fatty acids. And then there was a study by Aja, 9-month treatment study showing benefits. This has not been published though, unfortunately. And then finally a study by Bell finding that fish oil supplements, no surprise, improved omega-3 fatty acid levels. In the study we just finished, a 12-month treatment study, we looked at 6 different treatments, and vitamin and mineral supplements and essential fatty acids were the top 2, with gluten-free, casein-free diet being reported as almost as beneficial. So these are really the 3 biggies that I really urge you to think hard about doing, and this is especially important for the kids not getting fish regularly. So testing and recommendations, again, there are tests available for a few $100s, but you're comparing against a normal reference range, and the normal population levels are not optimal. So you want to mistrust the laboratory reference ranges and aim for the top of the reference ranges. Because fish is the major source of omega-3s, again, you can assume it's low if you aren't getting 4 servings or so a month. Now, the fish is a wonderful source of protein as well. The danger is that if you consume big fish that are very high in the food chain like shark and swordfish, they consume smaller fish which have consumed smaller fish. And so fish that are very top of the food chain like shark and swordfish can have high levels of toxic metals in them. So the FDA warns pregnant women not to eat 1 serving of shark, not to eat 1 serving of swordfish during their entire pregnancy, that just 1 serving of shark, 1 serving of swordfish during the entire pregnancy has so much mercury that it increases the risk of neurological damage to their infants. So what fish can you consider? Fish that are low in the food chain. Tuna is intermediate. You can consume a little tuna, but salmon is really great. So small fish, anchovies, if you like those, great. Okay, so the amount of omega-3s that we recommend is listed here, and again, probably a little bit of omega-6 as well, just to balance it out, because it's the balance. In the body, so often we want the right ratio of omega-3 to omega-6. There is a safety risk. This is a very small safety risk that about 1 to 2% of children have a severe behavioral response to fish oil. And that seems to be due, this was discovered by my colleague Tapan Aja at New York University when they were doing a study of 400 kids with autism. They found a few percent of them had a severe behavioral reaction to fish oil, occurred within a week or 2, and it appeared they eventually tracked it down to being due to a lack of carnitine. Carnitine is a substance in the body which transports fats, certain essential fats or certain fats into the mitochondria. And if you didn't have enough carnitine, then you are not being able to get the fats into the mitochondria where they can be burned. So basically it meant you had a severe carnitine deficiency. And by treating them with carnitine, then they could take the fish oil just fine. So it's actually a very effective test if you have a carnitine deficiency. So it's a very rare problem, 1 to 2% of the time. But if you have that problem, boy, you really want to treat it right away. And I'll explain more about carnitine in a little bit. Gut problems. We published a study a couple years ago showing that kids with autism who had GI problems, so that's the group in red, compared to the kids with autism who didn't have GI problems. The kids with autism with GI problems had worse speech, they had worse social interactions, they had worse sensory problems, they had worse physical and behavioral problems. So major challenges for them. And so we believe that GI function is very impaired in many kids with autism, not all, but many of them. And there's multiple reasons why. One of the reasons has to do with digestive enzymes. You can do a comprehensive digestive stool analysis, and that's a very indirect way to see if your food is being digested well, but basically it just involves they look at your poop and see if it looks like the food is being digested well. You can do that yourself and save yourself $100. All right? What you can do instead, however, is if your child has an endoscopy, it's now fairly common, and most labs have the ability, if you're doing an endoscopy, to also have your child's digestive enzyme levels measured. And again, at the study there are now 3 published studies, 2 by Horvath and 1 by Bowie, finding that many children with autism have a lack in digestive enzymes for digesting certain carbohydrates, especially milk sugar, but sometimes also other carbohydrates as well. So if your child is having loose or gaseous stools, especially after consuming dairy, probably lactose intolerant, but if it's after other carbohydrates, may have problems there too. So taking digestive enzymes, probably a good thing to do. There was one open label study done 10 years ago. The study had some limitations, but it seemed that there were some improvements due to it. We're doing a study right now of digestive enzymes, and it looks promising, I would say. The study's still ongoing. Very rare do digestive enzymes cause problems, and about half the time they seem to help. Gut bacteria. So now what's so important about the gut is that your gut has a huge amount of bacteria in it. That when you poop, half of your poop is bacteria, right? So you have a huge amount of bacteria living in your gut, 1 to 2 pounds of bacteria living in your gut, and most of them are beneficial. They help you digest your food, they help you with water balance, they help protect against pathogenic bacteria, they help fight against bad bacteria and bad yeast. And also they produce certain key vitamins like biotin and others. So some children with autism seem to have low levels of beneficial bacteria and or high levels of harmful bacteria or perhaps yeast. And these harmful bacteria and yeast can produce toxins that can severely impact intellectual functioning. If you don't believe me, walk into a bar on a Saturday night, and do you think people there, do you think the alcohol is affecting their intellectual functioning? Yes, alcohol is a yeast byproduct, and it's a relatively mild yeast byproduct. There are some much nastier toxins that yeast produce. So again, there's no doubt that yeast and bacteria can produce toxins that can affect your intellectual functioning. There are about 1,000 different types of bacteria that live in the human gut. Most of them are beneficial. There have been 5 studies showing that children with autism, however, the major difference in the medical history is that they had increased use of oral antibiotics. So we found in a number of studies, and other groups have found the same thing, one of the major differences is that on average, children with autism had about twice the usage of oral antibiotics during the first few years of life compared to typical kids, especially for ear infections. And the problem is those oral antibiotics destroy many of your beneficial bacteria, leaving the potential for bad bacteria to begin growing there. And so it was a small open label treatment study with a very potent non-absorbable antibiotic, vancomycin, and it found temporary improvement in symptoms, but unfortunately when they stopped treatment, they found that most of the benefits were lost. And so we know that the bacteria cause a problem. We didn't at the time know how to get rid of them. There have been several small culture-based methods. The problem with Traditional culture-based methods, you take stool, you try to grow it. Typically, you might, depending on the lab, be able to grow 10, 20, maybe 30 of the strains of bacteria out of the 1,000 that are there. You're seeing the tip of an iceberg with a culture-based method. So there have been 3 small studies using DNA-based methods. One of them, we just published a study on this a few months ago. We found that kids with autism had about 20% less diversity. They had about 20% fewer types of bacteria in their gut. So instead of 1,000 types, like healthy kids, they had only 800. And that's associated with a less healthy gut. And we also found that there are 3 particular strains of gut bacteria that they were low in. And when they were lower in that, then they had more of the pathogenic bad guys. That the 3 that they were low in were very protective. There have been many reports about yeast being elevated in autism, many anecdotal reports. We published a paper a couple years ago where we used a standard commercial testing lab, doctors' data. We sent them 60-some samples from typical kids, 60-some from kids with autism, 40-some from typical kids. We found some yeast, but similar levels in both groups, looking at it both by culture and under a microscope. So 2 different ways. I've talked with a number of top gastroenterologists, and they say yes, they have seen yeast overgrowth in children with autism. Tim Bowie says out of 1,000 kids that he scoped, probably under 10 have had a yeast overgrowth. So you can see it, huge yeast lining their GI tract, lining even their mouth like thrush, but very rare, very rare. But oddly, many kids with autism seem to benefit from antifungals. In fact, antifungals seem to be one of the most effective medications for reducing symptoms in autism, oddly enough. So it's a puzzle we don't fully understand. There is some commercial testing out there, some stool analyses that can look at a very limited number of gut bacteria and yeast. Unfortunately, they don't even have reference ranges for their tests, so they're limited. The best test, I think, is a visual test. You want to look at your child's poop, the toilet test, and see, is it a well-formed, medium brown stool? And if it looks very abnormal, remember that half of the stool is bacteria. So if it's yellow or greenish, if it smells unusually foul, you have a gut bacteria or possibly yeast problem. I think also it may relate to essential fatty acid levels. This is a hypothesis, but essential fatty acid levels we think are important for helping restore the integrity of the GI tract. There are many treatments out there. There's been very limited research on probiotics. The problem with most probiotics is that they are dairy-based. These are bacteria that live in milk. They are not bacteria that live normally in the human gut. And so we need probiotics that are present in the human gut. And unfortunately, there aren't those on the market now. Antifungals seem very helpful for many kids for reasons we don't fully understand, maybe just because they help reduce inflammation. There are a number of non-prescription antifungals out there. Going on a low-sugar, low-carb diet probably helps. What I'm especially intrigued about is fecal transplant. Which is just what it sounds like. You take a little poop from a healthy person, stick it in someone who's sick, and it reseeds their gut. Okay? Now, if that sounds really shocking, let me tell you, there's a condition called C. diff. It's a very nasty infection which mostly occurs in the elderly in hospitals. It kills 15,000 people a year in the US. It's a very difficult to treat infection. People will be treated with multiple antibiotics for months. It's life-threatening and eventually will kill 15,000 people a year. If you simply take, there have been quite a few studies showing this, if you simply take a tiny amount of poop from a healthy person, put it in their gut, 95% cure rate from a single dose. 95% cure rate. If you give it to them twice, it's 100% cure rate. It is astonishing. It is astonishing. So we're working with a group, and we hope to submit an IND to the FDA to do a fecal transplant study for kids with autism. There are also 3 probiotics that we're very interested in, which are not present in the human gut. They're not available commercially. We hope to study those in the next few months. So again, there are some treatments out there, but I think there's some even more promising treatments out there because most probiotics may have 1 to 10 strains. The human gut has 1,000 strains. Human feces contains 1,000 strains of all the right bacteria in all the right proportions. Unfortunately, most people wash their hands nowadays. So they just don't get it. All right. All right, you got to realize how my grad students love it when we do, oh no, another poop study. You've got to collect the samples. Okay. All right. And by the way, I want to point out that antibiotics, even though I talked about them, notice of all the medications, they're much more likely to make a child worse than better. They actually tend to be the problem because they're destroying the normal gut flora. So something to really use only very cautiously. All right, I need to speed up a little bit, as usual. Amino acids. When you consume protein, protein is a very large molecule, and your body needs to chop it up into individual amino acids. And so many children with autism have self-limited diets where they just may not eat enough protein, or they may have digestive problems, so they don't consume the protein very well. And so there can be a number of reasons why they can then have insufficient amino acids. So there are testing labs that can measure amino acids, either in the blood or in the urine. With urine, you have to be a little cautious how you interpret it. But the treatments are very simple. Either increase protein intake, or use digestive enzymes, or use a customized amino acid supplement. Or oddly enough, we found in our study that just giving them a vitamin mineral supplement actually indirectly seemed to improve amino acid levels as well. So there have been a number of studies out there. Unfortunately, most of them are badly flawed because they either did not compare against age-matched children, or they did not use fasting blood draws. So instead of seeing what is the baseline level, you're looking at the last hamburger the child ate for their meal. So it's very important to do it as a fasting overnight blood draw, or doing a 24-hour urine. Okay, thyroid supplements. Of order, perhaps 5 to 10% of the general population has a thyroid problem, and probably at least that many children do. Worldwide, this is one of the hugest problems. That roughly 80 million children worldwide suffer severe mental retardation simply due to a lack of iodine. And iodine is needed for normal thyroid function. So it's an important issue. We did a study a few years ago showing that children with autism may have unusually low iodine levels based on a measure in their hair. And then we went on to also find that in the urine, finding that there's a subset of kids with autism who had low levels in the urine. And urine is probably a better way to test it. We just completed a study where we looked at thyroid levels in 60-some children and adults with autism. And surprisingly, I thought we'd find many of them had a thyroid problem. We only found 2 of them had a major thyroid problem. But again, very simple, very standard medical test to do, very cheap. We're talking $30 or so. I think every child with autism should do it, especially if their mother has a thyroid problem or if the child seems to have low energy. This is one of the few treatments that seem to actually really help my daughter, who's a little bit of a couch potato. Found out she had low energy levels. When we checked her thyroid, it was low. Her mother's was also low. When we treated her, it boosted up her energy level. So it's very important for functioning. This is, however, again, one of the treatments you want to be cautious on because you can give too much of a thyroid supplement as well. So if you're on thyroid supplementation, you need to monitor it regularly. Too much can be a problem. Too little, you aren't getting all the benefits. You need to monitor it every few months. All right, melatonin. Many kids with autism have sleep problems. How many of you have a child with autism who has sleep problems? And how many of you have a sleep problem because of your child with autism? Okay, so it's a big problem, all right? Melatonin is a substance in your body that regulates sleep. Your body produces it as soon as it is dark, completely dark. A night light is enough to stop your body's production of melatonin. So you'd want to turn off night lights, all sources of light, in order to normalize melatonin production, right? The treatment is typically just to start with a low dose, increase if necessary, turning off all the lights as I mentioned. 1 milligram of melatonin, or even half of that for children, might be enough. You can go up to higher doses. The great thing about melatonin is in the animal treatment studies, it does not seem to be any level at which it is toxic. The only major side effect of giving melatonin to animals is that they live about 20% longer and healthier. Great supplement. Okay. However, and there are quite a few studies. There are now 9 studies showing abnormalities in melatonin levels or melatonin cycle in children with autism. There are 5 double-blind, placebo-controlled studies showing that melatonin improved falling asleep and also increased the duration of sleep. but it did not help with nighttime awakening. And the reason, I think, is that melatonin, although it's a great supplement, when you give it, it has a relatively short life in the body. And so melatonin actually comes from serotonin, major neurotransmitter, which in turn comes from tryptophan. So I think a better approach for kids for whom melatonin is not working or not working very well is to consider giving tryptophan, because then that will help the body produce melatonin throughout the night, as opposed to just giving them a quick burst when you give them the melatonin. So something to consider. And again, in our last study, we found many kids with autism were low in tryptophan. Sulfation. Many children with autism have excessive levels of sulfate in their urine, resulting in a low level of sulfate in the body. Sulfur is the fourth most common mineral in the body. Calcium's number 1, but sulfur's number 4, and it's not included in most vitamin mineral supplements because it's believed sulfur deficiencies are rare. Sure, they're rare, except in kids with autism. There have been quite a few studies showing that it's a standard way to test for sulfur deficiency is to give Tylenol and to see how long it takes the body to detoxify Tylenol, or acetaminophen, the active ingredient. And these 4 studies found that kids with autism took much longer to detoxify Tylenol. And in fact, based on that, you should probably never give Tylenol or acetaminophen to a child with autism, because it is actually a fairly toxic substance, and it accounts for over 100,000 emergency room visits a year in the US, that the level it requires to be effective as a pain reliever is very close to the level of toxicity. And the treatment for it, if you receive Tylenol poisoning, the treatment for it is to give glutathione, what our kids with autism are already low in. All right? So there's blood testing that is available to see if you're low in sulfate. There's one lab, Health Diagnostic, that offers it. A colleague of mine at New York University has measured many different ways to increase plasma sulfate, and he found that the 2 most effective ways were either 1, giving oral MSM, it's an over-the-counter nutritional supplement, or 2, just taking an Epsom salt bath, because Epsom salts are magnesium sulfate, and he found that after the kids with autism were in an Epsom salt bath, then they could measure a substantial increase in their level in their blood. So it is clearly well absorbed. There's a reason why people have been doing Epsom salt baths for a few hundred years. Right? And it works even better if you give it with a half cup of baking soda, that about doubles the absorption. We also found that giving a vitamin mineral supplement with MSM significantly improved sulfate levels. It didn't normalize it, but it got halfway there. So it was very helpful. As I mentioned, there have been 3 studies showing low free and plasma sulfate in kids with autism. There are 4 studies showing kids with autism don't detoxify acetaminophen, the active ingredient in Tylenol. And then 1 study by Waring showed the kids with autism had high amounts of sulfate in the urine, low amounts in their blood. Basically, the kidney is not working right in kids with autism. It is not recycling the sulfate. So the sulfate is being dumped out in the urine. One way to partly improve that is by giving molybdenum, an important mineral, but it seems we just need to replenish the source as well. Okay, moving on to glutathione. I've talked about this a little bit already, but Joel James really a number of years ago highlighted how important this was. It's the most important antioxidant in the body, and it also, not only did kids with autism have lower amounts of it, but what they had tended to be oxidized or inactive. She then treated them with 800 micrograms of folinic acid and 1,000 milligrams of trimethylglycine and found some improvements in glutathione. She then added in injections of vitamin B12, and that resulted in even more improvements, or normalization of glutathione levels. She then went on to do a larger study, which confirmed these original findings of low glutathione in kids with autism, and found that it's partly due to genetics, partly due to specific phenotypes, and also they've done a treatment study and actually just recently showed that if kids with autism were lower in glutathione, then they were the ones who were more likely to benefit from a dose of folinic acid. The kids were actually taking, in the first study, they were actually taking folic acid, and they still had this problem. Folic acid didn't work for them. They needed folinic acid in order for it to be beneficial. So testing, you can just measure levels of glutathione. There are a few labs that offer that. But unfortunately, strange enough, taking glutathione is not the right approach because glutathione is not well absorbed orally. We published a paper looking at taking it orally and taking it transdermally. It didn't help much. Very poor absorption because it's a big molecule. It's not absorbed very well. So instead, there are many other ways to do it. Talks more about it in my handout, but basically giving IV glutathione. But who wants to give an IV to their child every week? You can just take N-acetylcysteine, you can take vitamin C, you can use chelation therapy to remove it. And then I'll talk briefly about a paper we published a couple years ago in which we gave NADH, that's the active form of vitamin B3, which we had previously found kids with autism were very low in. And we then did another study in which we gave ribose, which is a special type of sugar in plants, which is very important in the human body as well. And we found that treating either with the active form of vitamin B3 or with ribose led to many improvements in glutathione and NADH and ATP production. Ribose, as I mentioned, is a special sugar that there's a tiny amount of it in food, but it's mostly made in your body if things are going well. But in kids with autism, they often aren't. Ribose is a building block for your DNA, for your RNA, for ATP, which is an important fuel for your body. It's a building block for the active form of vitamin B3 and for many other things. So it's a very important property, and we found that giving either ribose or NADH improved glutathione, improved NADH, increased levels of ribose, and increased SAM and ATP. So lots of good things from taking that. And again, giving either ribose or NADH boosted levels of ribose by a couple 100%. So big jump. And cheap, very effective. So to summarize, ribose and NADH seem to have very similar benefits, quickly improve methylation, glutathione, and ATP, but we need to do a larger study to see if it has an effect in behavior. In just 2 weeks, didn't seem to have much effect on behavior. Then we looked at another study we did, carnitine. Carnitine, I mentioned earlier, is a substance in the body which helps transport fats for burning as fuel into the mitochondria. And carnitine can be made to a limited extent by the body, but it seems that some kids with autism don't make it very well. The major dietary source of carnitine is beef. If your child is not eating beef of order twice a week, then they are at risk of carnitine deficiency. All right? So if your child is not eating beef, pork has about 1/3 the amount of carnitine in it as beef, but there's almost no carnitine in any other food that your child is likely to eat. So basically, if your child is not eating beef or pork, it's a major problem. There was one study that found decreased carnitine in children with autism. We went on to do a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial, a 90-day study. We gave a relatively high dose. Carnitine is an over-the-counter supplement, but you can also buy it as a prescription medication. Exact same material, they just slap a label on it. All right, so you can get it either way. This is a relatively high dose, and we found that it was generally well tolerated, minor side effects, a little bit of nausea or stomach upset, but I think if you gradually increase the dose, in this study we just instantly went to the top dose, I don't think that was such a great idea. But again, we found there were a few dropouts, but overall we had a physician a psychologist I should say, who evaluated the kids at the beginning and end of the study. She didn't know who was in each treatment group. She then found that 1/4 of the kids responded, and all of those 1/4 were in the treatment group, and none of them were in the placebo group. Right? So it wasn't a huge effect. We're not talking cure, but we're seeing a substantial improvement in symptoms observable in about half the kids, some mild improvement in a variety of symptoms, including 20% improvement in speech, 30% improvement in social interactions, 28% improvement in cognitive, 28% improvement in physical behavior. Oddly enough, not much improvement in muscle strength, and we thought it would actually affect. So we saw some benefits. There's been a follow-on study where they used twice the dose and found even more benefit. So it was very interesting. With a lot of these preliminary studies, we don't know what the optimal dose is. Because carnitine helps your mitochondria, it then also makes sense to give it with many other nutrients like CoQ10 and vitamin B3 and others, which also help your mitochondria function. right? So let's move on. Okay, I really have to speed up. Detoxification therapy. Low levels of glutathione mean that your child is less able to defend themselves against exposure to toxic metals. Glutathione binds to toxic metals, so one molecule of glutathione binds to one atom of lead, and then both are excreted in the bile. So every atom of lead you're exposed to results in a loss of one molecule of glutathione to get rid of it. And so many kids with autism also had increased use of oral antibiotics in infancy. And if your child, in a rat study, that rats who were put on oral antibiotics lost 90% of their ability to excrete mercury. Probably roughly the same thing is true for humans, all right? So the testing, there is testing done of urinary porphyrins. Porphyrins are a way to assess kidney function, so it's an indirect test. But I think a better test is just to give DMSA, which is an FDA-approved medication for treating lead poisoning in infants, and then measure what comes out. Because DMSA binds to toxic metals but is excreted in the urine. So if it comes out in the urine, it tells you two things. It tells you it was in the body, and it tells you the medication is pulling it out. So you just look at levels before you give the DMSA and after. According to the ARI survey data, it's a very effective treatment, actually the most highly rated treatment. We published a study showing that about 22 to 45% of autism severity could be predicted based on the level of toxic metals in the kids with autism. So using the most rigorous tool, the ADOS, we could predict who was more severe or not based on the kids who had more toxic metals in them, they had more severe autism. DMSA is a very safe way to remove several toxic metals. There was a small, very small increased loss, as with any chelator, of essential minerals, small loss of chromium, small loss of potassium, but minor. Eating one banana every 2 weeks was all you needed to do to prevent the loss of potassium. We found that about 20% of the kids didn't have much effect. DMSA didn't result in much increased excretion. 20%, they needed the DMSA for 1 to 2 months, and then their lead levels and other toxic metals dropped. But 60% of the kids, by the end of 3 months, were still excreting high amounts of toxic metals and needed treatment for even longer. Okay, changing subjects, so immune system regulation. There are many studies showing kids with autism have many abnormalities in their immune system. There have been several treatments proposed for them. One is IVIG, which is intravenous immunoglobulins. So you take immunoglobulins from healthy people and from blood donors, and you need several hundred to 1,000 donors to make one dose of IVIG. And then you inject the IVIG typically every 3 weeks. And one study done at UC Irvine found that about 4 of 10 kids benefited from it. But then there was a follow-on study of 26 kids showing most of them benefited from it. But if you stopped after 6 months, 22 of them lost the benefit when you stopped the therapy. So we now think you need to treat for 12 to 18 months. The problem is this is an incredibly expensive therapy because it takes so many donors to produce one dose. One dose may cost you anywhere from $2,000 to $4,000. And you might need that dose for 12 to 18 months. So an incredibly expensive therapy. Luckily, many families have been able to get insurance to pay for it because you can demonstrate through a simple blood test if your child has an immune deficiency. Many kids with autism do. In Phoenix, over 40 kids with autism have a demonstrated immune deficiency, and they've been treated with IVIG. And insurance has paid all of it. They won't pay for other things that we need more, but they'll pay for that. We did a study of Actos, which is a FDA-approved medication for treating certain types of inflammation. And we found in an open label study some benefits. However, we now have to go back and say that unfortunately, although that open label study suggested there was some benefits, the FDA has now issued a black box warning that Actos may increase the risk of congestive heart failure, fluid retention, and edema. It didn't occur during our study, but is a potential risk. And in fact, when we looked at survey data, we found that whereas IVIG seemed to help about half the kids, Actos seemed to only help about 20%, and about 19% actually got worse on Actos. So I don't think Actos is all that great. A low-dose naltrexone might have some benefit, but hasn't been any formal studies of it yet, just this. But there's one very intriguing study I want to mention. How am I doing on time? 5 minutes? Okay, I'm going to talk fast. So there's a very quick study, a very interesting study by Jeff Bradstreet, where he looked at a substance in the blood called nagalase. And I first have to get a little background on what a macrophage is. So a part of the immune system, the first responder in the immune system is a macrophage. When it encounters foreign enemies like bacteria or cancer cells, it reaches out pseudopods, it drags the bacteria into the cell and engulfs it and digests it. So it's a very important first responder part of the immune system. Jeff Bradstreet found that 90% of kids with autism had elevated nagalase. Nagalase is a substance that destroys GCMF, which is a signal to the macrophage to go on the attack, to go and attack enemies. So without that, the macrophages just sit idle and do nothing. There have been 4 studies showing that GCMF therapy was very effective versus certain types of cancer, because cancer cells produce high amounts of nagalase to then prevent the immune system from attacking it. And so in these studies, unlike chemotherapy or radiation therapy where you're killing most of the body, the GCMF therapy is actually helping the immune system to attack the cancer, and it's exceptionally well tolerated, almost no side effects. So Bradstreet went on to treat 40 kids with autism. So he found 90% of his patients had elevated levels of nagalase. He treated them with GCMAF. So he gave them back macrophage activating factor just from human blood donors. And this macrophage activating factor resulted in their nagalase level dropping from a very elevated level, 4 times normal, down to a near normal range. So great improvement in just 4 months. And behaviorally, on a scale of 0 to 6. So 6 is complete cure of autism. No one got there, but quite a few got to 5. They were really close. They had big improvements, and quite a few kids had some good improvements, and a few, 15%, didn't improve at all. But very well tolerated. The only minor side effect was a few kids had a minor rash for a few days. It is unfortunately rather expensive, maybe $600 a month, so not quite up there to IVIG, but still an expensive therapy. But it's very experimental right now, but very intriguing. We're actually in the midst of submitting a request to the FDA to let us do studies in kids with autism on that. Last treatment study I'll mention is hyperbaric oxygen therapy. There have been over 10 studies showing decreased blood flow in brains of children with autism. And an important issue with the blood is just getting enough oxygen to the brain. And so there have been several studies also that showed, 2 studies that showed when there's more decrease in blood flow, then you have more severe autistic symptoms. The reason for this is unknown, may relate to inflammation in the brain. Hyperbaric oxygen therapy absolutely increases blood oxygen in the blood quite dramatically, but temporarily. So a typical treatment might be 1 to 2 one-hour treatments a day for maybe 40 sessions. And the question is, will treatment for 1 to 2 hours out of a whole day be enough to have an effect? And the answer is maybe. There are several open-label studies for children with autism. Most suggest that hyperbaric oxygen therapy is helpful, but one study which used more rigorous pre- and post-assessment found absolutely no benefit. There have then been 2 randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled studies. One study showing there was some benefit in some measures, but not others, and the other study showed no benefit at all. So we have the controversy here, and research is sometimes like that. It's an expensive therapy, might run you a couple $1,000s or more, depending on how long you do it. But there's some research evidence for it, and some research evidence against it. So if you want to read more, there are a couple reviews that you can go to. So there's one safety concern, however, if your child has mitochondrial deficiency, full-blown mitochondrial disease, and this is present in a few % of kids with autism, and you know it if they did. The child would just be progressively getting worse. If they had that, this HBOT can cause serious injury or even death in those cases. You want to make sure your child does not have that very rare disorder before you treat it. It's possible, it's been hypothesized it might worsen seizures, but actually our national survey found it improved seizures. So again, a little question about that. So to summarize, I've gone over many research studies. There's even more described in the handbook. I've had to cut things a bit short. But the bottom line is there are many medical abnormalities well established in the scientific literature. For most of these abnormalities, we know how to treat them. If your child's low in vitamin B3, give them vitamin B3. If they're low in fatty acids, give them fatty acids. This is solid biochemistry, solid nutrition, good medicine. And so by following the testing and treatments that I've been recommending, I think many kids, not all, but I think many kids will see some improvement. In our last 12-month study, implementing just 6 of these treatments, we found the kids gained 9 points in IQ and had some other benefits as well. So we're very pleased. Now, I've covered a lot of things. So the last point I want to make is that please don't be overwhelmed that I've listed 17 different treatments. Just say, pick 1 or 2 or 3 and say, gee, I'm not giving my child Johnny, he's only eating 1 serving of vegetables a day, and that's French fries, okay? Ketchup doesn't count. And so I'm gonna try getting him some broccoli and some asparagus. Start with 1 step and then move on from there. And again, I hope I've given you some hints as to which treatments to consider first based on your child. And I'll recommend that you go to can I make an exhibitor recommendation? Okay, so I recommend you go check out the Kirkton booth. There are a lot of good nutrition supplements out there, and you've got an expert here, Dave Humphreys, president of Kirkman, who can tell you more about them. Hopefully he doesn't mind me saying that. All right, take care. Thank you.